Number 3. Gentlemen and Players. Old Raffles may or may not have been an exceptional criminal, but as a cricketer I dare swear he was unique. Himself a dangerous bat, a brilliant field, and perhaps the very finest slow bowler of his decade, he took incredibly little interest in the game at large. He never went up to the Lords without his cricket bat, and showed the slightest interest in the result of a match in which he was not himself engaged. Nor was this mere hateful egotism on his part. He professed to have lost all enthusiasm for the game, and to keep it up only from the very lowest motives. "Cricket," said Raffles, "like everything else, is good enough sport until you discover a better. As a source of excitement, it isn't in it with other things you wot of, Bunny, and the involuntary comparison becomes a bore. What's the satisfaction of taking a man's wicket when you want his spoons? Still, if you can bowl a bit, and though your cunning won't get rusty, and always looking for weak spots, just the kind of mental exercise one wants. Yet perhaps there's some affinity between the two things after all. But I'd chuck my cricket tomorrow, Bunny, if it wasn't for the glorious protection it affords a person of my proclivities." "How so?" said I. "It brings you before the public. I should have thought far more than either safe or wise." "My dear Bunny, that's exactly where you make a mistake. To follow crime with a reasonable impunity, you simply must have a parallel, ostensible career. The more public, the better. The principle is obvious. Mr. Peace, of pious memory, disarmed suspicion by acquiring a local reputation for playing the fiddle and taming animals. And it's my profound conviction that Jack the Ripper was really an eminent public man whose speeches were very likely reported alongside his atrocities. Fill the bill in some prominent part, and you'll never be suspected of doubling it with another of equal prominence. That's why I want you to cultivate journalism, my boy, and sign all you can. And it's the one and only reason why I don't burn my hats for firewood." Nevertheless, when he did play there was no keener performer on the field, nor one more anxious to do well for his side. I remember how he went to the nets before the first match of the season, with his pockets full of sovereigns which he put on the stumps instead of the boils. It was a sight to see the professionals bowling like demons for the hard cash. For whatever a stump was hit, a pound was tossed to the bowler, and another in its stead, while one man took £5 with the ball that spread eagle the wicket. Raffles' practice cost him either 8 or 9 sovereigns, but he had absolutely first-class bowling all the time, and he made 57 runs the next day. It became my pleasure to accompany him to his matches, to watch every ball he bowled or played or fielded, and to sit chatting with him in the pavilion when he was doing none of these 3 things. You might have seen us there, side by side, during the greater part of the gentleman's first innings against the players who had lost the toss, on the second Monday in July. We were to be seen, but not heard, for Raffles had failed to score, and was uncommonly cross for a player who cared so little about the sport. Merely taciturn with me, he was positively rude to more than one member who wanted to know how it had happened, or who ventured to commiserate him on his luck. There he sat, with a Zingari straw hat tilted over his nose and a cigarette stuck between his lips that curled disagreeable at every advance. I was therefore much surprised when a young fellow of the exquisite type came and squeezed himself in between us, and met with a perfectly civil reception despite the liberty. I did not know the boy by sight, nor did Raffles introduce us, but their conversation proclaimed at once the slightness of acquaintanceship and a license on the lad's part which combined to puzzle me. Mystification reached its height when Raffles was informed that the other's father was anxious to meet him, and he instantly consented to gratify that whim. Use the ladies' enclosure. Will you come around? Oh, with pleasure, said Raffles. Keep a place for me, Bunny. And they were gone. Young Crowley, said some voice further back. That's Harrow's 11. I remember him, worst man in the team. Keen cricketer, however. Stopped till he was 20 to get his colours. Governor made him. Keen breed. Oh, pretty, sir. Very pretty. The game was boring me. I came only to see old Raffles perform. Soon I was looking wistfully for his return, and at length I saw him beckoning me from the palings to the right. Want to introduce you to old Amerseth, he whispered when he joined me. They've a cricket week next month, and when the boy Crowley comes of age, and we've both got to go down and play. Both? I echoed. Both? But I'm no cricketer. Shut up, said Raffles. Leave that to me. I've been lying for all I'm worth, he added sculpturally, as we reached the bottom of the steps. I trust you not to give the show away. There was the gleam in his eyes that I knew well enough everywhere, but was unprepared for in those healthy, sane surroundings, and it was with very definite misgivings and surmises that I followed the Zingari blazer through the vast flower bed of hats and bonnets that bloomed beneath the ladies' awning. Lord Amersteth was a fine-looking man with a short mustache and a double chin. He received me with much dry courtesy, through which, however, it was not difficult to read the less flattering tale. I was accepted in the inevitable appendage of the invaluable Raffles, with whom I felt deeply incensed as I made my bow. I've been bold enough, said Lord Amersteth, to ask one of the gentlemen of England to come down and play some rustic cricket for us next month. He is kind enough to say that he would have liked nothing better, but for this little fishing expedition of yours, Mr. And Lord Amersteth succeeded in remembering my name. It was, of course, the first I had ever heard of that fishing expedition, and I made haste to say it could be put off easily and should certainly be put off. Raffles gleamed approval through his eyelashes. Lord Amersteth bowed and shrugged. You're very good, I'm sure, he said, but I understand you're a cricketer yourself. He was one at school, said Raffles with infamous readiness. Not a real cricketer, I was stammering in the meanwhile. In the 11, asked Lord Amersteth. I'm afraid not, but only just out of it, declared Raffles to my horror. Well, we can't all be gentlemen of England, said Lord Amersteth slyly. My son Crowley only just scraped into the 11 at Harrow, and he's going to play. I may even come myself at the pinch, so won't you be the only duffer if you are one, and I shall be very glad if you come down and help us too. You shall flog a stream before breaking after dinner, if you like. I should be very proud. I was beginning to, as a mere prelude to resolute excuses, but the eye of Raffles opened wide upon me, and I hesitated weakly and was lost. Oh, then that's settled, said Lord Amersteth, with the slightest suspicion of grimness. It's to be a little weak, you know, when my son comes of age. We play the Free Foresters and the Downshire gentlemen, and probably some local lot as well. But Mr. Raffles will tell you all about it, and Crowley shall write. Another wicket! By Jove, they're all out. Then I'll rely on you both. And, with a little nod, Lord Amersteth rose and sidled to the gangway. Raffles rose also, but I caught the sleeve of his blazer. What are you thinking of? I whispered savagely. I was nowhere near the 11. I'm no sort of cricketer. I shall have to get out of this. Not you, he whispered back. You needn't play, but come you must. If you wait for me at 6:30, I'll tell you why. But I could guess the reason, and I am ashamed to say that it revolted me much less than the notion of making a public fool of myself on a cricket field. My gorge rose at this, as it no longer rose at crime, and it was in no tranquil humor that I strolled about the grounds while Raffles disappeared in the pavilion. Nor was my annoyance lessened by the little meeting I witnessed between young Crowley and his father, who shrugged as he stopped and stooped to convey some information, which made the young man look a little blank. It may have been pure self-consciousness on my part, but I could have sworn that the trouble was their inability to secure a great Raffles without his insignificant friend. Then the bell rang, and I climbed to the top of the pavilion to watch Raffles bowl. No subtleties are lost up there, and ever a bowler was fit of them. It was A.J. Raffles, on this day, as, indeed, all the cricket world remembers. One had not to be a cricketer oneself to appreciate the perfect command of pitch and break, his beautifully easy action, which never varied with a varying pace, his great ball on the leg stump, his dropping the head ball, in a word, the indefinite integrity of the versatility attack. It was no mere exhibition of athletic prowess. It was an intellectual treat, and one with a special significance in my eyes. I saw the affinity between the two things, and saw it in that afternoon's tireless warfare against the flower of the profession's cricket. It was not that Ruffles took too many wickets for a few runs. He was too fine a bowler to mind being hit, and time was short, and the wicket good. What I admired, and what I remember, was a combination of resource and cunning, of patience and precision, of headwork and handiwork, which made every other of the artistic whole. It was also characteristic of that other Raffles whom I alone knew. I felt like bowling this afternoon, he told me later in the hansom. With a pitch to help me, I'd have done something big, as it were. 3 or 38 out of the 4 that fell isn't so bad for a slow bowler on the plumb wicket against those fellows. But I felt venomous. Nothing roused me more than being asked about for my cricket as though I were a pro myself. Then why on earth go? To punish them, and because we shall be jolly hard up, Bunny, before the season's over. Ah, I said, I thought it was that. Of course it was. It seems they're going to have a very dickens of a week of it. Balls, dinner parties, swagger house party, general junketings, and obviously a house full of diamonds as well. Diamonds galore. As a general rule, nothing would induce me to abuse my position as a guest. I've never done it, Bunny, but in this case we're engaged like the waiters and the band. And by heaven, we'll take our toil. Let's have a quiet dinner somewhere and talk it over. It seems rather a vulgar sort of theft, I remarked, and to this, my single protest, Raffles instantly assented. It is a vulgar sort, he said, but I can't help that. We're getting vulgarly hard up again, and there's an end to it. Besides, these people deserve it and can afford it. And don't you run away with the idea that all will be plain sailing. Nothing will be easier than getting some stuff, and nothing harder than avoiding all suspicion, as, of course, we must. We may come away with no more good than a working plan of the premises. Who knows? In any case, there's weeks of thinking in it for you and me. But those weeks will not weary you further than by remarking that the thinking was done entirely by Raffles, who did not always trouble to communicate his thoughts with me. His reticence, however, was no longer an irritant. I began to accept it as a necessary convention of these little enterprises, and after our last adventure of the kind, more especially after its denouement, my trust in Raffles was much too solid to be shaken by a want of trust in me, which I still believe to have been more of an instinct of a criminal than the judgment of the man. It was on Monday, the 10th of August, that we were due at Milchester Abbey, Dorset, and the beginning of the month found us cruising about that very country with fly-rods actually in our hands. The idea was that we should acquire at once a local reputation as decent fishermen, and some knowledge of the countryside, with a view to further and more deliberate operations in the event of an unprofitable week. There was another idea which Raffles kept to himself until he had got me down there. Then one day he produced a cricket ball in the meadow we were crossing, and threw me catches for an hour together. More hours were spent in the bowling to me than on the nearest green, and if I was never a cricketer, at least I came nearer to being one by the end of the week than I had ever been before. Incidents began early on Monday. We had sailed forth from a desolate little junction within quite a few miles of Milchester, and had been caught in a shower, run for shelter in the wayside inn. A florid, overdressed man was drinking in the parlor, and I could have sworn it was by the sight of him that Raffles recoiled on the threshold, and afterwards insisting on returning to the station through the rain. He assured me, however, that the odor of the stale ale had almost knocked him out, and I had to make what I could of his speculative, downcast eyes and knitted brows. Milchester Abbey is a grey quadriangular pile, deep-set in rich wooded country, and twinkling with triple rows of quaint windows, every one of which seemed to light as we drove up in time to dress for dinner. The carriage had whirled us under I know not how many triumphant arches, in process of construction, and past the tents and flagpoles of a juicy-looking cricket field, on which Raffles undertook to bowl up on his reputation. But the chief signs of festival were within, where we found the enormous house party assembled, including more personas of pomp and majesty and dominion than I had ever encountered in one room before. I confess I felt overpowered. Our errand and my own preferences combined to rob me of an address on which I had sometimes plumed myself, and I have a grim recollection of my nervous relief when dinner was at last announced. I knew little of what the ordeal was about to prove. I had taken in much less formidable young lady than might have fallen to my lot. Indeed, I began by blessing my good fortune with respect. Miss Milhush was merely the rector's daughter, and she had been asked to make an even number. She informed me both of the facts before the soup reached us, and her subsequent conversation was characterized by the same engaging candor. It exposed what was little short of a mania for imparting information. I simply had to listen, to nod, and to be thankful. When I confessed to knowing very few of those present, even by sight, my entertaining companion proceeded to tell me who was everybody, beginning on my left and working consequently round to her right. This lasted quite a long time, and really interested me, but a great deal that followed did not. And obviously, to recapture my unworthy attention, Miss Helhush suddenly asked me in a sensational whisper whether I could keep a secret. I said I thought I might, whereupon another question followed, in a still lower and more sensational tone. "Are you afraid of burglars?" Burglars! I was roused at last. The word stabbed me. I repeated in that horrified query. "So I've found something interesting to interest you at last," said Miss Melhush in naive triumph. "Yes, burglars. Don't speak so loud. It's supposed to be kept a great secret. I really oughtn't tell you at all." "But what is there to tell?" I whispered with a satisfactory impatience. "You promise not to speak of it?" "Of course." "Well, then, there are burglars in the neighborhood." "Have they committed any robberies?" "Not yet." "Then how do you know?" "They've been seen in the district. Two well-known London thieves." "Two?" I looked at Raffles, and had looked at him often during the evening, envying him on his high spirits, his iron nerve, and his buoyant wit, his perfect ease and self-composition. But now I pitied him. Through all my own terror and consternation, I pitied him as he sat eating and drinking, and laughing and talking, without a cloud of fear or of embarrassment on the handsome, charming, daredevil face. I caught up my champagne and emptied my glass. "Who has seen them?" I asked calmly. "A detective. They were traced down from a town 2 days ago. They're believed to have designs on the Abbey." "But why aren't they run in?" "Exactly what I asked Papa on the way here this evening. He says there's no warrant out against them at present, and all can be done is to watch their movements." "Oh, so they're being watched." "Yes, by a detective who's down here on purpose. And I heard Lord Amersteth tell Papa that they were seen this afternoon at Warbeck Junction." The very place where Raffles and I had been caught in the rain. Our stampede from the inn was now explained, and on the other hand, I was no longer to be taken by surprise by anything that my companion might have to tell me, and I succeeded in telling her in the face with a smile. "This is really quite interesting, Miss Melhuish," said I. "May I ask how you come to know so much of such a thrilling business?" "It's Papa," was the confidential reply. "Lord Amersteth consulted him, and he consulted me. But for heaven's sake, don't let it on. I can't think what tempted me to tell you." Miss Melhuish giggled. "You may trust me, Miss Ellis, but aren't you frightened?" "Not in a bit. They won't come to the rectory. There's nothing for them there. But look round the table. Look at all the diamonds. Look at old Lady Melrose's necklace alone." The Dowager Marchioness of Melrose was one of the few persons whom it had been unnecessary to point out to me. She sat on Lord Amersteth's right, flourishing her ear trumpets and drinking champagne with her usual notorious freedom, as dissipated and kindly a dame as the world had ever seen. It was a necklace of diamonds and sapphires that rose and fell about her ample neck. "They say it's worth £5,000 at least," continued my companion. "Lady Margaret told me so this morning." That's Lady Margaret Amersteth, next to your Raffles, you know. "And the old dear will wear them every night. Think what haul they would be. No, we don't feel immediate danger in the rectory." When the ladies rose, Miss Melhuish bound me to fresh vows of secrecy, and left me, I should think, with some remorse for her indiscretion, but more satisfaction at the importance at which it had undoubtedly given her in my eyes. The opinion may smack of vanity, though in reality the very springs of conversation reside in that same human, universal itch to thrill the auditor. The peculiarity of Miss Melhuish was that she must be thrilling at all costs, and thrilling she had surely been. "I spare you my feelings for the next 2 hours. I tried hard to get a word in with Raffles, but again and again I failed. In the dining room, he and Crowley lit their cigarettes with the same match, and had their heads together all the time. And the drawing interminable nonsense into the ear trumpet of Lady Melrose, whom he knew in town. Lastly, in the billiard room they had a great and lengthy pool, which I sat aloof and chafed more than ever in the company of a very serious Scotsman, who had arrived since dinner, and who would talk of nothing but the recent improvements to instantaneous photography. He had not come to play in the matches, he told me, but to obtain for Lord Amersteth such a series of cricket photographs as had never been taken before, whether as an amateur or a professional photographer. I was unable to determine. I remember, however, seeking distraction in little bursts of resolute attention to the conversation of this bore. And so at last the long ordeal ended. Glasses were emptied, men said good night, and I followed Raffles to his room. "It's all up," I gasped, as he turned up in the gas and shut the door. We're being watched. We've been followed down from the town. There's a detective here on the spot. How do you know? Asked Raffles, turning upon me quite sharply, but without the least dismay. And I told him how I knew. Of course, he added. It is the fellow we saw in the inn this afternoon. The detective, cried Raffles. Do you mean to say you don't know a detective when you see one, Bunny? If it wasn't that fellow, which is? Raffles shook his head. To think that you've been talking to him for the last hour in the billiard room and wouldn't spot what he is. A Scottish photographer? I paused aghast. Scotch he is, said Raffles, and photographer he may be. He is also Inspector Mackenzie of Scotland Yard, the very man I sent a message to that night last April, and you couldn't spot who he was in a whole hour. Oh, Bunny, Bunny, you were never built for crime. But, I said, if that was Mackenzie, who was the fellow who bolted from at Warbeck? The man he's watching. But he's watching us. Raffles looked at me with a pitying eye and shook his head again before handing me his open cigarette case. I don't know whether smoking forbidden in one's bedroom, but you might take one of these and stand tight, Bunny, because I'm going to say something offensive. I helped myself with a laugh. Say what you like, my dear fellow, it really isn't you and I that Mackenzie's after. Oh, then, if it isn't, and couldn't be, and nobody but a born Bunny would suppose for a moment that it was, do you seriously think he would sit here and knowingly watch his man playing pool under his nose? Well, he might. He's a cool hand, Mackenzie, but I'm not cool enough to win a pool under such conditions. At least, I don't think I am. It would be interesting to see. The situation wasn't free from stain as it was, although I knew he wasn't thinking of us. Crowley told me all about it after dinner, you see, and I'd seen one of the men for myself this afternoon. You thought it was a detective that made me turn tail in the afternoon. I really don't know why I didn't tell you at the time, but it was just the opposite. That loud, red-faced brute is one of the cleverest thieves in London, and once I had a drink with him at our mutual fence. I was an East Ender from tongue to toe at the moment, but you will understand that I don't run unnecessary risks by recognition by a brute like that. He's not alone, I hear. Oh, by no means. There's at least one other man with him, and it suggested that there may be an accomplice here in the house. Did Lord Crowley tell you? Crowley and the champagne between them. In confidence, of course, just as your girl told you, but even in confidence he never let on about Mackenzie. He told me there was a detective in the background, and that was all. Putting him up as a guest is evidently their big secret, to be kept from the other guests because it might offend them, but more particularly from the servants whom it's doubtless his billet to watch. That's my reading of the situation, Bunny, and you will agree with me that it's indefinitely more than interesting than we could prove to have managed it would prove. But infinitely more difficult for us, said I with a sigh of pusillanimous relief. Our hands are tied for this week at all events. Not necessarily, my dear Bunny, though I admit that the chances are against us. Yet I'm not so sure of that either. There are all sorts of possibilities in this three-cornered combination. Set A to watch B, and he won't have an eye left for C. That's the obvious theory, but then Mackenzie is a very big A. I should be sorry to have my body about me and that man in the house. Yet it would be great to nip between A and B and score off of them both at once. It would be worth the risk, Bunny, to do that. It would be worth risking something merely to take an old hand like B and his men at their own game. Eh, Bunny? That would be something like a match. Gentlemen and players at a single wicket, by Jove. His eyes were brighter than I had known them for many days. They shone with a perverted enthusiasm which was roused in him only by the compilation of some new audacity. He kicked off his shoes and began pacing his room with a noiseless rapidity. Not since the night of the old Bohemian dinner at Reuben Rothenthal had Raffles exhibited such excitement in my presence, and I was not sorry at the moment to be reminded of the fiasco to which that banquet had been the prelude. "My dear Raffles," said I in this very own tone, "you're too far fond of this uphill game, and you will eventually fall a victim of the sporting spirit and nothing else. Take a lesson from our last escape, and fly lower as you value our skins. Study the house as much as you like, but do not go and shove your head into Mackenzie's mouth." My wealth of metaphor brought him to a standstill, with his cigarette between his fingers and a grin beneath his shining eyes. "You're quite right, Bunny. I won't. I really won't. Yet, you saw old Lady Melrose's necklace. I've been wanting it for years, but I'm not going to play the fool, honor bright, and not yet. Yet, by Jove, to get to windward of the professors and the Mackenzie, too. It would be a great game, Bunny. It would be a great game." "Well, you mustn't play this week." "No, no, I won't, but I wonder one. That's what one wants to know. I wonder if they really got an accomplice in the house. How I wish I knew their game. But it's all right, Bunny. Don't be jealous. It shall be as you wish." And without assurance I went off to my own room, and so to bed with an incredibly light heart. I had still enough of the honest man in me to welcome the postponement of the actual felonies, to dread their performance, deplore their necessity, which is merely another way of stating to the patient fact that I was incomparably a weaker man than Raffles, while every wit was wicked. I had, however, one rather strong point. I possessed, however, um, I possessed the gift of dismissing unpleasant considerations, not intimately connected with the passing moment, entirely from my mind. Through the exercise of this faculty, I had lately been living my frivolous life in town as a much ignoble enjoyment as I had derived from the year before, and similarity here at Milchester, in a long-dreaded cricket week, I had, after all, a quite exciting time. It was true that there were other factors in this pleasing disappointment. In the first place, mirabile dictu, there were one or two even greater duffers than I on the Abbot Cricky field. Indeed, quite early in the week, when it was the most valuable to me, I gained considerable kudos for a lucky catch, a ball which I had merely heard the hum and struck fast with my hand, which Amasis himself gasped in public congratulations. This happy accident was not to be undone even by me, and as nothing succeeds like success, and the constant encouragement of one great cricketer on the field was in itself an immense stimulus. I actually made a run or two in my very next innings. Miss Melhuish said pretty things to me that night at the great ball in honor of Viscount Crowley's majority. She also told me that was the night on which the robbers would assuredly make their raid, and was full of arch tremors when she sat out in the garden, though the entire premises illuminated all night long. Meanwhile, the quiet Scotchman took countless photographs by day, which he developed by night in the darkroom, admirably situated in the servants' part of the house, and it was my firm belief that only two of his fellow guests knew Mr. Cellophane of Dundee for Inspector Mackenzie of Scotland Yard. The week was to end with the trumpetry match of the Saturday, which two or three of us intended abandoning early in order to return to town that night. The match, however, was never played. In the small hours of Saturday morning, a tragedy took place at Milchester Abbey. Let me tell of the thing as I saw and heard it. My room opened upon the central gallery, and it was not even the same floor on which was Raffles, and I think all other men that were quartered. I had been, in fact, put into the dressing room of one of the grand suites, and my two near neighbors were old Lady Melrose and my host and hostess. Now, by the Friday evening, the actual festivities were at an end. For the first time this week, I must have been sound asleep since midnight, when all at once I found myself sitting up breathless. A heavy thud had come against my door, and now I heard hard breathing and the dull stamp of muffled feet. "I've got ye," muttered a voice. "It's no use struggling." It was a Scotch detective, and a new fear turned me cold. There was no reply, but the hard breathing grew harder still, and the muffled feet beat the door to a quicker measure. In sudden panic, I sprang out of bed and flung open my door. A light burnt low on the landing, and by it I could see Mackenzie swaying and staggering in a silent tussle with some powerful adversary. "Hold this man!" he cried as I appeared. "Hold the rascal!" But I stood like a fool until a pair of them backed into me, when, with a deep breath, I flung myself on the fellow, whose face I had seen at last. It was one of the footmen who waited at the table, and no sooner had I pinned him than the detective loosened his hold. "Hang on him!" he cried. "There's more of 'em below." And he went leaping down the stairs, as other doors opened and Lord Amersteth and his son appeared simultaneously in their pajamas. At that my man ceased struggling, but I was still holding him when Crowley turned up the gas. "What the dickens is all this?" asked Lord Amersteth, blinking. "Who was that ran downstairs?" "Cellophane," I said hastily. "Aha!" he said, turning to the footfall. "So you're the scoundrel, are you? Well caught, well caught. Where is he caught?" I had no idea. "Here's Lady Melrose's door open, and Crowley. Lady Melrose! Lady Melrose!" "You forget she's deaf," said Lord Amersteth. That'll be her maid." The inner door had opened. Next instant there was a little shriek, and a white figure gesticulated on the threshold. "Well, don't set la crème de Madame la Marquise. La fenêtre est ouverte. Let us stop her." "Window open and jewel case gone, by Jove!" exclaimed Lord Amersteth. "Et Madame la Marquise, va-t-elle bien?" "Oui, monsieur, la daughter." "Sleeps through it all," said my lord. "She's the only one, then." "What made Mackenzie Cellophane bolt?" young Crowley asked me. "It said there were more of them below." "Why the deuce couldn't you tell me so before?" he cried, and he went leaping down the stairs in his turn. He was followed by nearly all the cricketers, who now burst upon the scene in a body, only to desert it for the chase. Raffles was one of them, and I gladly would have been another, had not the footman chosen his moments to hurl me from him and take a dash in the direction from which they had come. Lord Amersteth had him in an instant, but the fellow fought desperately, and took two of us to drag him downstairs amid a terrified chorus of half-open doors. Eventually, we handed him over to two other footmen who appeared with their nightshirts tucked into their trousers, and my host was good enough to compliment me as he had led the way outside. "I thought I heard a shot," he added. "Didn't you?" "I thought I heard 3. And out we dashed into the darkness. I remember how the gravel pricked my feet, how the wet grass numbed them as we made it for the sound of voices in an outlying lawn. The dark of the night was that we were in the cricketers' midst before we saw the shimmer of their pajamas, and the Lord Amersteth almost trod on Mackenzie as he lay prostrate on the dew. "What's this?" he cried. "My God, what happened?" "It's Cellophane," said the man who knelt over him. "He's got a bullet in something. We're alive." "It's alive?" "Barely. Good heavens. Where's Crowley?" "Here I am," said a breathless voice. "It's no good, you fellows. There's nothing to show which way they've gone. Here's Raffles. He's chucked it too." And they ran up panting. "Well, we've got one of them, at all events," muttered Lord Amersteth. "The next thing to do is get the poor fellow indoors. Take his shoulder, somebody. Now his middle. Join hands under him, and all together now. That's the way. Poor fellow. Poor fellow. His name isn't Sophan at all. He's a Scotland Yard detective down here for these very villains. Raffles was the first to express surprise, but he had also been the first to raise the wounded man. Nor had any of them a stronger or more tender hand in the slow procession to the house. In a little while we had the senseless man stretched on the sofa in the library, and there, with ice on his wound and brandy for his throat, his eyes opened and his lips moved. Wood almost bent down to catch the words. Yes, yes, he said. We've got one of them safe and sound. The brute you collared upstairs. But Amerson bent lower. By Jove, lowered the jewel case out of the window, did he? And they've got all clean away with it. Well, well, I only hope we'll be able to pull this good fellow through. He's off again. An hour passed, and the sun was rising. I found a dozen young fellows on the settees in the billiard hall, drinking whiskey and soda water in their overcoats and pajamas, and still talking excitedly in one breath. The timetable was being passed from hand to hand. The doctor was still in the library, and at last the door opened. Lord Amersteth put in his head. It isn't hopeless, he said, but it's bad enough. There'll be no cricket today. Another hour, and most of us were on our way to catch the early train. Between us, we filled a compartment almost to suffocation, and still we talked all together of the night's event, and still I was a little hero in my way, for having kept my hold on the one ruffian who had been taken. And my gratification was subtle and intense. Raffles watched me under lowered lids. Not a word had we had together, not a word did we have until we left the orders in Paddington, and were skimming through the familiar, crowded streets in a hansom with noiseless tires and a tinkling bell. Well, Bunny, said Raffles, so the professors have it, eh? Yes, I said, and I'm jolly glad. That poor Mackenzie has a bowl in his chest. That you and I would have had a decent sight for once. He shrugged his shoulders. You're hopeless, Bunny, quite hopeless. I take it you wouldn't have refused your share if the boodle had fallen on us. Yet you positively enjoy coming off as the second best, for the second time running. I confess, however, that the professor's methods were full of interest to me. I, for one, have probably gained as much of an experience as I have lost in other things. That lowering the jewel case out of the window was a very simple and effective expedient. Two of them had been waiting below for it for hours. How do you know? I asked. I saw one of them from our window, which was just above the dear old lady's. I was fretting for the necklace in particular, and when I went up to turn on for the last night, I happened to look out of my window. In point of fact, I wanted to see whether the one below was open, and whether there was the slightest chance of working an oracle on my sheet for a rope. Of course, I took the precaution of turning off my light first, and I was lucky that I did. I saw the pros right below, and they never saw me. I saw a tiny little luminous disk just for an instant, and then again for an instant a few minutes later. Of course, I knew what it was, for I have my own watchdial daubed in luminous paint. It makes a lantern of a sort, when you can get no better. For these fellows were not using theirs as a lantern. They were under the old lady's window, and were watching the time. The whole thing was arranged with their accomplice inside. Set a thief to catch a thief. In a minute I had guessed what the whole thing proved to be. And you did nothing, I exclaimed. Oh, on the contrary, I went downstairs and went straight into Lady Millward's room. You did? Without a moment's hesitation. To save her jewels, and I was prepared to yell as much into her trumpet ear for all the house to hear. But the dear lady is too deaf and too fond of her dinner to wake easily. Well, she didn't stir. And yet you allowed the professors, as you call them, to take her jewels, case and all. All but this, said Raffles, thrusting his fist into my lap. I would have shown it to you before, but really, old fellow, your face all days is worth a fortune in the firm. As he opened his fist to shut it next instant, a bunch of diamonds and sapphires that I had last seen encircling the neck of Lady Melrose.